Footsteps echoed sharply against the polished floor of JFK Terminal 4, but it wasn't the sound of a hurried traveler. It was the sound of entitlement marching toward a devastating reality check. When a senior flight attendant decided a quietly dressed black passenger didn't belong in her exclusive first-class cabin, she expected a swift apology and a walk of shame to economy. Instead, she received a neatly folded, watermarked document that would instantly end her career and rewrite corporate history. Fluorescent lights hummed high above the sprawling concourse of John F. Kennedy International Airport, casting long, sterile shadows across the bustling morning crowd. It was a crisp Tuesday in late October, the kind of morning where the elite travelers moved with practiced efficiency, their rolling Rimowa suitcases gliding silently over the terrazzo floors. Gate B32 was preparing for the departure of Flight 104 to London Heathrow, a premier transatlantic route operated by Sovereign Airways, a legacy carrier known for its old-world luxury and, lately, its closely guarded financial hemorrhaging. Arthur Pendleton stood near the edge of the boarding lane, his attention fixed on the steady stream of text messages illuminating his phone screen. At 42, Arthur was a man who possessed the kind of wealth that no longer needed to announce itself. He wore a simple navy Loro Piana cashmere sweater, perfectly tailored dark denim, and a pair of well-worn Berluti loafers. There were no flashy logos, no oversized watches, only a vintage Patek Philippe Calatrava tucked quietly beneath his left cuff. In his right hand, he held a scuffed, chestnut-brown leather briefcase that had accompanied him through a decade of ruthless corporate negotiations. Just a few miles away, in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking Manhattan, Arthur's private equity firm, Pendleton Capital, had spent the last 48 hours finalizing a hostile takeover that would shock the aviation industry. Sovereign Airways had been bleeding capital for 5 years, mismanaged by a complacent board of directors. By 8 a.m. that morning, the ink had dried. Arthur was flying to London not for a vacation, but to personally clean house at the airline's European headquarters. Standing at the boarding podium, adjusting her silk neck scarf with practiced precision, was Barbara Gable. Barbara was an institution at Sovereign Airways, with 25 years of service pinned to the lapel of her tailored navy blue uniform. She considered herself the ultimate gatekeeper of the sky. To Barbara, the first-class cabin was not merely a section of a Boeing 777-300ER. It was her personal fiefdom, a sanctuary for the old money, the celebrities, and the corporate titans she felt privileged to serve. Over the years, her dedication had curdled into a rigid, prejudiced elitism. She prided herself on her ability to spot new money, or worse, those who didn't belong in her cabin at all. Ladies and gentlemen, Sovereign Airways is now pleased to invite our first-class and Diamond and Elite members to board Flight 104 to London Heathrow, the gate agent announced over the PA system. Arthur slid his phone into his pocket, picked up his briefcase, and stepped into the priority lane. He was the third person in line. Ahead of him was an elderly British woman draped in Burberry, and a loud, red-faced hedge fund manager barking into a Bluetooth earpiece. Barbara stood beside the scanner, officially there to welcome the VIPs, though she spent most of her time internally judging the passengers. When the British woman passed, Barbara offered a warm, deferential bow. When the hedge fund manager beeped through, she offered a tight but respectful smile, recognizing the scent of aggressive Wall Street capital. Then Arthur stepped forward. Barbara's smile vanished, replaced by a microscopic tightening of her jaw. Her eyes dropped from Arthur's unassuming face to his casual sweater, down to his scuffed briefcase, and finally to the color of his skin. In Barbara's rigidly categorized world, a black man dressed in unbranded casual wear simply did not belong in Zone 1. She immediately assumed he was a standby passenger, an airline employee traveling on a buddy pass, or simply someone who couldn't read the massive signs indicating the boarding zones. Arthur extended his digit boarding pass beneath the scanner. The machine let out a bright, cheerful beep, flashing a glowing green light. The screen clearly displayed Pendleton, Arthur, Seat 2A, First Class. Barbara's hand shot out, physically blocking Arthur's path to the jet bridge. "Excuse me, sir," Barbara said, her voice dripping with the kind of saccharine sweetness that masked deep condescension. "This line is for first class and Diamond Elite members only. Economy boarding will begin in approximately 20 minutes. If you'll just step to the side." "I am in first class," Arthur replied evenly, his voice calm and entirely devoid of irritation. He had dealt with people like Barbara countless times. He gestured toward the scanner screen. "Seat 2A. Barbara leaned over, squinting at the screen as if the computer system itself had committed treason. She blinked, her mind scrambling for an explanation. A glitch, she thought. Or perhaps a fraudulent ticket, a stolen frequent flyer account. "May I see your passport, please?" she demanded, dropping the customer service facade. The hedge fund manager who had boarded just ahead of Arthur hadn't been asked for his passport at the gate. The TSA and check-in counters had already verified it, but Arthur didn't argue. He reached into his coat pocket, produced his dark blue passport, and handed it over. Barbara opened it, examining the photograph, and then looking up at Arthur, as if searching for a discrepancy. She spent an uncomfortably long time flipping through the stamped pages. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Arthur asked, his tone still perfectly leveled. He glanced at his watch. "I have a rather pressing schedule waiting for me in London." "I am simply verifying the documentation, sir," Barbara snapped, her cheeks flushing slightly. "We have had issues with system errors upgrading economy passengers by mistake. Sovereign Airways maintains a very strict standard for our premier cabin." "I assure you there is no mistake," Arthur said gently. He reached out, taking his passport back from her rigid fingers. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Without waiting for her permission, Arthur stepped past her and walked down the sloping carpet of the jet bridge. Barbara stared after him, her chest heaving with indignant rage. She snatched the gate agent's manifest clipboard. There it was, printed in black and white, 2AA, Pendleton. But there was no corporate title listed next to his name, no VIP marker that the airline usually appended to celebrities or politicians. To Barbara, this confirmed her suspicion. He was a nobody who had somehow gamed the system, and he was walking into her cabin. "I'll handle this," Barbara muttered to the bewildered gate agent. She spun on her heel and marched down the jet bridge, determined to rectify what she viewed as a gross violation of the natural order. The interior of the Sovereign Airways Boeing 777 first-class cabin was designed to mimic a high-end luxury hotel. There were only 8 suites, each enclosed by sliding privacy doors crafted from polished walnut and brushed aluminum. The air smelled faintly of lavender and expensive leather. Soft, ambient amber lighting washed over the spacious pods. Arthur found seat 2A on the left side of the aircraft. He stowed his briefcase carefully under the plush ottoman, hung his jacket on the small brass hook, and sank into the wide, ergonomic leather seat. He let out a slow, quiet breath. The acquisition negotiations had been brutal. The former CEO of Sovereign Airways had fought tooth and nail to keep his golden parachute, but Arthur's legal team had dismantled him flawlessly. Now all Arthur wanted was a glass of sparkling water, 7 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and a smooth arrival at Heathrow. He reached for the touchscreen panel to adjust his seat when a shadow fell across his suite. Barbara stood in the aisle. Her posture was rigid, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Beside her stood a junior flight attendant, holding a silver tray of pre-departure champagne, looking intensely uncomfortable. "Sir," Barbara said, her voice carrying a sharp, projecting quality that was designed to be heard by the other passengers in the cabin, "I am going to have to ask you to gather your belongings." Arthur paused, his hand hovering over the touchscreen. He looked up at Barbara. "Excuse me, I believe you have taken a wrong turn," Barbara continued, her tone patronizing. "This is the first-class cabin. Your seat is undoubtedly further back. If you step out, my junior associate here can direct you to the main cabin." Across the aisle in seat 2K, an older gentleman reading the Financial Times lowered his newspaper, his eyebrows raised. In 1A, a wealthy socialite shifted in her seat to watch the spectacle. The quiet hum of the aircraft made Barbara's voice sound exceptionally loud. "I scanned my boarding pass at the gate," Arthur said, keeping his voice low to avoid a scene. "The system confirmed seat 2A. We already had this conversation." "Yes, and as I mentioned, we have been experiencing system glitches," Barbara lied smoothly. "Furthermore, this specific suite, seat 2A, is currently reserved for a high-level corporate VIP. I cannot have you occupying it. I need you to move to the back immediately so we can prepare for our actual premier clientele." Arthur stared at her. The audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking. There was no VIP coming. He was the VIP. He knew the passenger manifest better than she did. His team had audited the airline's entire operational database the night before. The flight was only half full in first class. "Let me understand this," Arthur said, leaning back into his seat and crossing his legs. "You are asking me to vacate a seat I paid for, based on a non-existent glitch for a VIP who doesn't exist?" "Do not raise your voice at me," Barbara hissed, though Arthur hadn't raised his voice by a single decibel. "I am the senior purser on this aircraft. I am responsible for the safety and comfort of our elite passengers. You are currently trespassing in a $12,000 suite. I will not ask you again. Gather your bag and move to economy, or I will have you removed from this aircraft." The blatant racism hung in the air, unsaid but deafeningly loud. "People like you do not belong here." It was written in the severe line of her mouth, in the hard glare of her eyes, in the way she positioned her body to physically block him into the pod. Arthur felt a familiar cold anger settling in his chest. Throughout his life, building Pendleton Capital from a small startup into a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm, he had faced countless variations of Barbara Gable. Bankers who assumed he was the assistant. Real estate brokers who asked for his credit score before showing him a property. But there was something uniquely egregious about this moment, happening on an aircraft that he legally owned. "What is your name?" Arthur asked quietly. Barbara touched her gold nameplate. "Barbara Gable. And I have been flying with Sovereign Airways for 25 years. You do not intimidate me." "Barbara," Arthur said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I am not moving to economy. I am not leaving this aircraft. I strongly suggest you return to the galley and perform your duties, or this situation is going to escalate in a way that will be catastrophic for your career." Barbara let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Catastrophic for my career? You are threatening a crew member. That is a federal offense." She turned to the junior flight attendant, who looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "Go to the jet bridge. Tell the captain we have a disruptive, belligerent passenger who is refusing crew instructions. Have them call ground security. We are going to have him escorted off." "Barbara, wait, his boarding pass scanned green," the junior attendant whispered frantically. "Do as I say," Barbara snapped. The young woman flinched and hurried up the aisle. Barbara turned back to Arthur, a triumphant smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "You people always think you can just bully your way into spaces where you don't belong. You should have just walked to the back when I gave you the chance." Now you're going to be escorted out in handcuffs." Arthur didn't say a word. He calmly reached down, pulled his scuffed leather briefcase onto his lap, and flicked the twin brass latches open. The metallic click sounded like gunshots in the sudden, suffocating silence of the cabin. Word spread quickly. Within 3 minutes, the quiet ambience of the first-class cabin was shattered by the heavy footsteps of airport authority. Barbara stood near the cockpit door, playing the role of the threatened victim to perfection. She was flanked by Gregory, the red-faced lead gate agent, and 2 Port Authority police officers whose heavy utility belts clanked with every movement. Behind them stood Captain Miller, a grizzled veteran pilot who looked deeply annoyed by the delay. "That's him, officers." Barbara pointed a trembling finger at Arthur, who was sitting perfectly still in seat 2A, a thick manila envelope resting on his lap. He bypassed the gate protocols, forced his way onto the aircraft, and is now refusing to vacate a VIP suite. When I asked him to show his boarding pass, he threatened my career. Officer Davies, a burly man with a shaved head, stepped into the aisle and approached Arthur's suite. He rested his hand casually near his radio. "Sir," Officer Davies said, his voice deep and authoritative, "I'm going to need you to step out of the seat and bring your belongings to the front galley. We need to clear this up off the aircraft." Arthur looked at the officer. "Officer Davies, is it? I appreciate you doing your job. However, I have committed no crime. I scanned a valid boarding pass. I am sitting in the seat assigned to me. The only person causing a disruption on this flight is Ms. Gable. He's lying," Barbara interjected sharply. "He doesn't have a valid ticket for that suite. I want him off my plane." "Ma'am, please let me handle this," Davies said to Barbara. He turned back to Arthur. "Sir, under aviation law, the flight crew has the final say on passenger seating. If the senior purser wants you off, you have to get off. If you refuse, you're trespassing, and I will be forced to physically remove you. Now let's not make this difficult. Please stand up." The older gentleman in seat 2K stood up. "Officer, for what it's worth, this man hasn't done anything." The flight attendant came over and started harassing him out of nowhere. "Thank you, sir. Please sit down," the second officer commanded, shutting down the intervention. Captain Miller pushed his way through the small crowd. "Listen, folks, we have a departure slot to meet. If we miss it, we're sitting on the tarmac for 2 hours. Sir," he looked at Arthur, "I don't know how you got past the gate, but Miss Gable says that seat is held for a corporate executive. I need you to step off the plane so we can sort out your ticketing." Arthur looked at Captain Miller, then at Barbara, whose eyes were alight with cruel victory. She had summoned the police, the captain, and the gate agent. She had successfully turned a simple seating assignment into a public humiliation, purely because her prejudices could not comprehend Arthur's presence. "Captain Miller," Arthur said, his voice echoing clearly in the silent cabin. "Are you aware of the corporate restructuring announcement that was scheduled to go out to all Sovereign Airways employees at 8:15 a.m. Eastern Time?" The captain frowned, confused. "What? Check your company email, Captain," Arthur said calmly. "We don't have time for this nonsense." Barbara shrieked, losing her composed veneer. "Officers, remove him. He is delaying the flight." "I'm not going to ask again, sir," Officer Davies said, taking a step closer and reaching out to grasp Arthur's arm. "Don't touch me," Arthur warned, his voice suddenly carrying a lethal, commanding edge that froze the officer in his tracks. The raw authority in Arthur's tone wasn't that of a belligerent passenger. It was the tone of a man who commanded thousands of employees and billions of dollars. Arthur unclasped the manila envelope on his lap. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy blue spine. The crisp white paper bore the official embossed logo of Sovereign Airways at the top, juxtaposed with the stark, modern logo of Pendleton Capital. Mrs. Gable stated that this seat is reserved for a high-level corporate VIP, Arthur said, looking directly into Barbara's widening eyes. A VIP she believed I could not possibly be. She also referred to this aircraft as her plane. Arthur handed the stack of documents over the aisle partition directly to Captain Miller. Captain, what you are holding is a countersigned, legally binding acquisition agreement. As of 8 o'clock this morning, my firm, Pendleton Capital, has purchased a 62% controlling stake in Sovereign Airways. The signatures on page 42 are those of your former CEO, the chairman of the board, and myself. Captain Miller stared down at the documents. His eyes scanned the bold header, Majority Stake Acquisition and Transfer of Operational Control. He flipped to the back. The signatures were there, notarized and stamped with the federal corporate seal. He looked at the printed name under the buyer's signature line. Arthur Pendleton, Chief Executive Officer, Pendleton Capital. The captain's face went completely pale. He looked from the document to the casually dressed black man sitting in seat 2A. Mr. Pendleton? Captain Miller stammered, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. Yes, Captain, Arthur replied. I was flying to London to meet with the European operational directors to discuss the restructuring of this airline's toxic corporate culture. It seems I don't need to wait until I reach Heathrow to begin. The silence in the cabin was so absolute that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roaring engine. Officer Davies slowly stepped back, pulling his hand away from Arthur's suite as if the leather was on fire. The gate agent, Gregory, looked like he was about to faint. Barbara Gable stood frozen. The triumphant sneer had melted off her face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her mind scrambled to process the information, but the reality was too massive, too crushing. The man she had just spent the last 15 minutes insulting, degrading, and trying to have arrested was not a stowaway. He was the owner of the airline. He was her ultimate boss. Tut! That's impossible, Barbara stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. He's lying. It's a forged document. Miss Gable. A new, sharp voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned. Stepping onto the aircraft from the jet bridge was Richard Cunningham, the Vice President of Flight Operations for Sovereign Airways. He was sweating through his expensive Tom Ford suit, clutching a tablet, and looking completely breathless, having clearly sprinted from the terminal concourse. Richard pushed past the police officers and stopped in front of seat 2A. He didn't look at Barbara. He looked directly at Arthur, and his shoulders slumped in profound defeat and terror. Mr. Pendleton, Richard gasped, trying to catch his breath. I just received the call from the board. I am so deeply sorry I wasn't at the gate to escort you personally. There was a miscommunication with the transition team. It's quite all right, Richard, Arthur said, steepling his fingers. Your senior purser, Miss Gable, has been keeping me very entertained. Richard turned slowly to look at Barbara. The color had completely drained from her face. She looked at Richard, then at the acquisition papers in the captain's hand, and finally at Arthur. The reality of the situation crashed over her with the weight of an ocean wave. 25 years of superiority. 25 years of looking down on people. All of it shattered by a single piece of paper and a man who refused to be moved. Mrs. Gable, Richard said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear, knowing his own job was on the line because of her actions. What exactly have you done? Panic seized Barbara's throat like a physical vice. The tailored, navy blue Sovereign Airways uniform that had served as her impenetrable armor for 2.5 decades suddenly felt like a suffocating straitjacket. She stared at Richard Cunningham's pale, sweat-sheened face, then looked down at the terrifyingly undeniable legal documents trembling in the captain's hand. The heavy, embossed seal of Pendleton Capital stared back at her a silent condemnation of the colossal error she had just made. She stammered, her hands fluttering uselessly as she tried to summon the commanding, aristocratic tone she had wielded just moments before. "Mr. Cunningham, Richard, I was following our strict security protocol. There was an irregularity at the gate. This gentleman's boarding pass, scanned perfectly green," a quiet, trembling voice interrupted. Everyone turned. Standing near the galley partition was the junior flight attendant, Chloe. She was barely 22, her hands tightly gripping the edge of a beverage cart to hide her shaking. Despite her obvious terror at speaking out of turn in front of the Vice President of Flight Operations, she held her ground. His pass scanned green. "Gable, you told me it was a glitch, but the system clearly accepted him. You just didn't want him in the cabin." Barbara spun on the young woman, her eyes flashing with desperate venom. "Shut your mouth, Chloe. You know nothing about elite security profiles, or how we maintain the standard of this cabin." "Security profiles." Arthur's voice cut through the tense air, smooth, quiet, and dangerously sharp. The entire aircraft seemed to hold its collective breath. "Is that the official terminology Sovereign Airways uses to profile its paying customers, Richard?" Richard Cunningham flinched violently, as if Arthur had reached out and struck him. "No, sir, absolutely not, Mr. Pendleton. That is unequivocally not our corporate policy. We do not profile passengers." "Then please explain to me," Arthur said, slowly and deliberately sliding the thick acquisition documents back into his manila envelope, "why your senior purser felt the absolute necessity to lie about a non-existent VIP, fabricate a computer system glitch, and summon armed police officers to remove a man who had provided a valid boarding pass and a federal passport." The two Port Authority police officers exchanged a heavy, incredibly uncomfortable look. Officer Davies, the burly man who had been seconds away from physically grabbing a billionaire CEO, took a very deliberate, tactical step backward, resting his hands firmly on his duty belt away from his radio and cuffs. He looked at the socialite in seat 1A, who had silently raised her smartphone and was recording the entire interaction. "Sir," Officer Davies addressed Arthur, his previously authoritative tone replaced by a deeply respectful, apologetic cadence. "We were informed by the flight crew that an unticketed, aggressive passenger was trespassing and refusing to comply with federal aviation regulations. If we had known the reality of the situation, that you were the lawful ticket holder, let alone the owner of the airline, we would not have intervened in this manner." "I understand entirely, Officer Davies," Arthur replied, his voice softening slightly as he looked at the policeman, though he never broke his peripheral gaze from Barbara. "You were weaponized. You were used by an employee who assumed that because I do not fit her archaic, prejudiced aesthetic of wealth, I must be a criminal. You were doing your job based on a lie. You may go. Your presence is no longer required. Have a safe flight, Mr. Pendleton," Davies said quickly. He tipped his hat slightly, grabbed his partner's shoulder, and practically shoved him up the jet bridge, desperate to escape the blast radius of the corporate nuclear bomb that was actively detonating in the first-class cabin. Barbara watched her armed enforcers retreat, leaving her entirely defenseless. The reality of her vulnerability finally pierced through her blinding arrogance. The power dynamic had inverted so violently she felt physically dizzy. "Mr. Pendleton, sir, please," Barbara pleaded, her voice dropping an octave, adopting a frantic, sycophantic whine that was pathetic to witness. "It was a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. I am deeply dedicated to this airline. I have served Sovereign Airways for 25 years. My service record is impeccable. I am a consummate professional. I was only trying to protect the integrity of the first-class experience for our passengers." "Protect it from whom?" Arthur asked simply. The question hung in the air, cold, heavy, and unforgiving. Barbara opened her mouth, but no words came out. There was no corporate jargon, no procedural loophole, and no customer service handbook that could save her from answering that specific, devastating question. "You assumed I was poor," Arthur continued, his voice echoing in the pin-drop silence of the cabin. "You assumed I lacked the capital to sit in a $12,000 suite, and when I politely stood my ground, your immediate response was to threaten me with arrest, using the police as a tool to enforce your personal bigotry. You told me, and I quote verbatim, 'You people always think you can just bully your way into spaces where you don't belong.' Tell me, Barbara, who exactly did you mean by you people?" Barbara's face crumpled. The immaculate facade she had spent years cultivating shattered completely. She looked at Richard for help, her eyes begging for a lifeline, but the vice president of flight operations was staring fixedly at the floor, actively distancing himself from her toxic, sinking ship. 25 years, Arthur mused, resting his hands casually on his scuffed Berluti briefcase. "I don't view your tenure as an asset, Barbara. I view it as 25 years of unchecked entitlement. How many other passengers have you degraded? How many people who saved for months for a once-in-a-lifetime trip were treated like garbage simply because their luggage wasn't designer, or their skin wasn't the right color?" "That isn't true," Barbara cried, a single tear finally spilling over her mascara and cutting a dark track down her powdered cheek. "I am highly rated. The executives love me. They always request me for their flights. The executives you served yesterday are currently clearing out their desks in Manhattan." Arthur corrected her softly, a lethal edge in his tone. "And as of right now, you are going to clear yours." He looked up at Richard Cunningham. "Richard, if this aircraft pushes back from the gate with Ms. Gable on board, your resignation will be the second one I process today. Do I make myself perfectly clear?" Silence stretched to the absolute breaking point. Richard Cunningham swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply above his tight collar. His mind raced. He had a mortgage in Connecticut, 2 kids in private universities, and a lucrative stock options package that was currently hanging by a thread. The choice before him was binary: protect a bigoted, lying flight attendant who had just humiliated the new owner of the company, or save his own career under the terrifyingly efficient new regime of Pendleton Capital. It was no choice at all. "Gable," Richard said, his voice dropping all pretense of corporate warmth, hardening into a cold, uncompromising command. "Give me your wings and your security badge." Right now, Barbara gasped, physically recoiling as if he had demanded she cut off a limb. "Richard, you can't do this. You don't have the authority. The Flight Attendants Union will have you in arbitration for months. The union cannot and will not protect you from a gross violation of federal aviation boarding protocols, creating a hostile racist environment, and initiating a fraudulent police call." Richard snapped, his own lingering fear transforming into white-hot anger at the woman who had nearly cost him his livelihood. "You lied to the captain. You lied to the gate agent. You lied to Port Authority. Hand over the badge, Barbara. You are officially suspended without pay, pending immediate termination." Trembling uncontrollably, Barbara reached up to her lapel. Her fingers fumbled uselessly with the intricate clasp of her gold wings, the golden emblem that had been the symbol of her self-imposed royalty for decades. She finally unpinned them, the heavy metal clicking softly against her plastic security badge as she pulled the lanyard over her head. She handed them to Richard, who snatched them away without a shred of sympathy or hesitation. "Get your belongings and exit the aircraft," Richard commanded, pointing toward the forward galley. As Barbara turned to walk toward the galley to retrieve her monogrammed roller bag, She had to face the very cabin she claimed to protect. The walk felt like 1,000 miles. The wealthy socialite in 1A was looking at her with absolute unfiltered disgust, her phone still recording every miserable second. The older gentleman in 2K simply shook his head slowly, refusing to make eye contact. Nobody offered a word of comfort. Nobody stood up to defend her. She was stripped of her authority, exposed as a fraud, and expelled in disgrace from her own kingdom. When Barbara finally dragged her bag up the jet bridge, her shoulders hunched and her face buried deep in her silk scarf to hide her sobbing, the heavy metallic thud of the aircraft door sealing shut behind her sounded exactly like a vault, locking her out of her life forever. Back in the cabin, Richard Cunningham stood awkwardly in the aisle, clutching Barbara's discarded wings in his sweaty palm. He looked at Arthur, waiting for the executioner's axe to inevitably swing his way. "Mr. Pendleton," Richard began, his voice shaky, his posture submissive. "I cannot express how deeply, profoundly apologetic I am on behalf of Sovereign Airways management. A full formal apology will be issued by my office immediately. I will personally ensure you are compensated for this horrendous—" "Stop." Arthur raised a hand, cutting off the desperate corporate groveling instantly. "Do not offer me airline miles on a company I already own, Richard. It's insulting to my intelligence." Richard snapped his mouth shut, his face flushing crimson. "Barbara Gable was a symptom, Richard. She is not the disease," Arthur said, his eyes scanning the luxurious cabin before settling back on the vice president. "A flight attendant does not act with that level of brazen, racist impunity unless she knows the management structure above her will protect her. She believed her behavior was entirely acceptable because, for 25 years, it obviously was." Arthur opened his briefcase and pulled out a sleek black iPad. He tapped the screen a few times, pulling up a highly encrypted internal dashboard, and slid the device across the center console toward Richard. "When I land in London," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low commanding register, "I want a complete, unredacted audit of every passenger complaint filed against the JFK-based first-class crew over the last 10 years. Cross-reference them by the race and socioeconomic background of the passengers involved. I want to see exactly how many valid complaints were buried by your Human Resources Department. If I find out that you, or anyone else in your operational department, routinely dismissed these reports to protect legacy employees like Barbara, you will be joining her in the unemployment line before the sun sets today." Richard nodded furiously, his face turning ashen at the prospect of the impending audit. "Yes, sir, absolutely, sir. I will have the data team begin the pull immediately." "Now," Arthur said, dismissing the vice president with a subtle final shift of his posture, "tell Captain Miller to request pushback. I have a board meeting in London, and Sovereign Airways is already costing me money by sitting at this gate." Richard practically bowed, scurrying toward the cockpit to deliver the orders. Within 60 seconds, the intercom crackled to life, the static breaking the heavy tension in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We sincerely apologize for the delay this morning. We have successfully resolved our boarding irregularity, and we are now fully cleared for pushback and taxi to the runway. Flight attendants, prepare doors for departure and cross-check." As the massive Boeing 777-300ER shuddered to life, the massive GE-90 engines whining as the aircraft began rolling backward away from the terminal, the junior flight attendant, Chloe, approached Arthur's suite. She was carrying a polished silver tray, holding a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon and a steaming lavender-scented towel. "Mr. Pendleton?" Chloe asked softly, her hands still trembling slightly, though this time from residual adrenaline rather than pure fear. "May I offer you a pre-departure beverage?" Arthur looked up at the young woman. He remembered how she had tried to intervene, whispering that his pass had scanned green. Even when Barbara was screaming in her face, she had shown a crucial shred of integrity when it was professionally terrifying to do so. "Thank you, Chloe," Arthur smiled warmly, taking the champagne glass. The icy, ruthless executive demeanor softened entirely, revealing the genuine, observant humanity beneath. "And Chloe—" "Yes, sir," she replied, standing up a little straighter. "You handled yourself exceptionally well under immense pressure today," Arthur told her, his tone earnest. "Sovereign Airways needs far more crew members who respect the passengers, and far fewer gatekeepers. Keep up the good work. Your professionalism has been noted." A bright, genuine smile broke across Chloe's face, washing away the lingering anxiety of the morning. "Thank you so much, Mr. Pendleton. Please enjoy your flight." As the aircraft climbed steeply into the crisp morning sky, banking gracefully over the Atlantic Ocean, Arthur reclined his wide leather seat and finally closed his eyes. The battle on the plane was won, but he knew the war for the company's deeply rotted soul was just beginning. Thousands of feet below, standing on the concrete curb outside the arrivals level of Terminal 4, Barbara Gable was shivering violently in the autumn wind. She didn't have her wings, she didn't have her badge, and she had entirely lost her dignity. But as she pulled her smartphone from her trenchcoat pocket, her blinding despair began to rapidly metastasize into something far more dangerous: pure, unadulterated vengeance. She scrolled rapidly through her extensive contacts until she found the name of a man who hated Pendleton Capital just as much as she did: Thomas Arrington. He was the recently ousted Vice President of Human Resources, the very man who had personally covered up her passenger complaints for years to protect the old guard, and who had been unceremoniously fired by Arthur's ruthless transition team at exactly 8 a.m. that morning. Barbara tapped the green call button and pressed the phone hard against her ear, oblivious to the travelers bustling past her. "Thomas?" Barbara hissed into the receiver, looking up to watch the silver speck of Flight 104 disappear into the low clouds. "It's Barbara. I was just thrown off my own aircraft by Arthur Pendleton. He humiliated me in front of the entire cabin. He fired me on the spot." There was a dark, venomous chuckle on the other end of the line. "I heard, Barbara. Word travels fast. The whole executive floor in Manhattan is in absolute chaos. Pendleton thinks he can just walk in, buy the board out, and take everything we spent decades building." "I want to destroy him," Barbara said, her voice shaking with raw, acidic malice. "I want to ruin his reputation before his plane even touches down in London. You still have the backdoor access codes to the internal passenger manifests, don't you? The ones that show Pendleton's travel history and private companion lists." "I do," Thomas Arrington replied smoothly, the sound of a lighter flicking and a cigar cherry glowing audible through the phone. "And I happen to know a couple of sleazy, high-paying tabloids in the UK who would love to print an exclusive, completely fabricated story about the new thug billionaire CEO having a violent meltdown and physically assaulting a senior flight attendant." Barbara smiled, a cold, ugly expression that mirrored the darkest, most irredeemable parts of her soul. "Send it, Thomas. Send everything you have. By the time he lands, I want the world to think he's a monster." Cruising at 38,000 feet over the frigid expanse of the North Atlantic, Arthur Pendleton did not sleep. The soft amber glow of the Boeing 777 first-class cabin reflected off the screen of his encrypted laptop. He was connected to the aircraft's satellite internet, deep in a video conference with his executive team back in Manhattan. "Arthur, we have a rapidly escalating situation," Victoria Hayes announced, her voice crisp and urgent through his noise-cancelling headphones. Victoria was Pendleton Capital's ruthless chief communications officer, a woman who had cut her teeth managing crisis PR at Edelman, the global public relations behemoth, before Arthur poached her. 10 minutes ago, my inbox was flooded with requests for comment from The Sun, the Daily Mail, and Bloomberg. Someone is actively shopping a highly damaging, fabricated story about you to the British and American press. Arthur took a slow sip of his sparkling water. Let me guess. The story claims I had a violent, unprovoked meltdown at JFK and physically assaulted a senior flight attendant to force my way into a first-class suite. Victoria blinked, clearly taken aback. How did you know the exact phrasing? The tabloids are claiming they have internal incident reports and leaked passenger manifests confirming you had to be restrained by Port Authority police. They are preparing to run the story the minute your flight touches down at London Heathrow. If this hits the wire, our shareholders are going to panic. A newly minted airline owner assaulting his own crew is a catastrophic headline. It is a desperate fabrication, Victoria, Arthur replied smoothly, his mind already piecing together the corporate espionage at play. The senior purser, Barbara Gable, attempted to illegally profile and eject me from the aircraft before takeoff because she didn't believe a black man in a sweater belonged in her cabin. I fired her on the spot. But a flight attendant doesn't have the clearance to pull my private travel history or manipulate internal incident logs to send to the press. Thomas Arrington, a new voice, chimed in. It was David Roth, Arthur's lead cybersecurity director. Arthur, I'm looking at the server logs right now. Someone using Arrington's legacy administrative credentials bypassed the firewall 20 minutes ago and downloaded the JFK security dispatch logs, altering the notes before exporting them to an external IP address. Arrington was the VP of Human Resources. We fired him at 8 o'clock this morning. He's collaborating with the flight attendant to sabotage the acquisition. Arthur's eyes narrowed, a cold, calculated fury settling into his chest. Barbara Gable wasn't just a bigot. She was a willing pawn in a corporate smear campaign orchestrated by the exact toxic management Arthur was trying to eradicate. They thought they could ambush him while he was trapped in a metal tube over the ocean, unable to defend himself until the PR damage was irreversible. David, lock down every remaining legacy server and flag Arrington's IP address for federal wire fraud, Arthur commanded, his tone lethal. Victoria, do not issue a standard denial. A denial just feeds the tabloid frenzy. We are going to provide them with the unequivocal truth, and we are going to do it so publicly that it destroys Arrington and Gable simultaneously. We need irrefutable proof, Arthur, Victoria warned. Without it, it's a billionaire CEO's word against a traumatized veteran flight attendant. The press will feast on you. I will get you the proof, Arthur said softly. He closed his laptop and stood up. The cabin was quiet, most of the passengers sleeping under plush duvets. Arthur walked silently up the aisle to seat 1A. The wealthy socialite who had recorded the entire confrontation was awake, sipping a mimosa and scrolling through a tablet. She was Lady Catherine Beaufort, a prominent British philanthropist who had absolutely zero tolerance for the kind of archaic classism Barbara had displayed. "Excuse me, Lady Beaufort," Arthur whispered, standing politely outside her suite. She looked up, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Mr. Pendleton, that was quite the masterclass in hostile corporate restructuring you delivered earlier. I must say, seeing that dreadful woman finally get her compens was the highlight of my travel year. She has been terrorizing passengers on this route for a decade. I am glad to have been of service." Arthur smiled warmly. "However, it seems Ms. Gable is not quite finished. She is currently attempting to leak a fabricated story to the press, claiming I violently assaulted her. I noticed you were recording the interaction at the gate. Lady Beaufort's eyes lit up with predatory delight. I recorded every miserable racist syllable that fell out of her mouth in stunning 4K high definition, including the part where the Port Authority officers backed away and apologized to you. Would you like me to send it to your legal team? I would be eternally grateful, Arthur replied. Within 5 minutes, the massive unedited video file was securely airdropped to Arthur's iPad. He immediately forwarded it to Victoria Hayes at his Manhattan headquarters. Victoria Arthur typed into the secure chat, "Here is the weapon. I don't want you to just send this to the tabloids. I want you to send this to Reuters, the Associated Press, and the New York Times. Draft a press release announcing a total overhaul of Sovereign Airways' HR department, citing this exact video as the catalyst. Let the world see exactly who Barbara Gable and Thomas Arrington are." Flight 104 touched down on the damp tarmac of London Heathrow's Terminal 5, exactly on schedule. The sky was a bruised, heavy grey, typical of a British autumn afternoon. As the massive Boeing aircraft taxied toward the VIP arrival gates, Arthur could see the flashing lights of news cameras pressing against the terminal glass. Thousands of miles away in a dark Manhattan apartment, Thomas Arrington and Barbara Gable sat glued to a television screen, watching a live feed from BBC News. They were waiting for the anchor to break the story of Arthur Pendleton's violent arrest. Barbara was clutching a glass of wine, her hands shaking with vindictive anticipation. She had lost her job, but she was about to ruin the man who took it from her. Back in London, the jet bridge connected to the aircraft with a heavy mechanical thud. Arthur Pendleton adjusted his cashmere sweater, picked up his scuffed Berluti briefcase, and walked out the door. He was flanked by Richard Cunningham, who looked like a man walking to the gallows, and 2 airport security directors. As Arthur stepped into the arrivals concourse, a mob of British paparazzi and financial journalists surged forward, shouting questions over the din of the airport. "Mr. Pendleton, is it true you assaulted a flight attendant? Arthur, are you facing charges from the Port Authority? What does this mean for the Sovereign Airways acquisition?" Arthur did not shy away from the flashing bulbs. He did not duck his head or let his security team push the reporters aside. Instead, he stopped dead in the center of the concourse, holding up a single hand. The raw, commanding presence that had terrified Barbara Gable on the airplane now captivated the entire press corps. The shouting died down to a low murmur. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Arthur began, his voice projecting clearly across the terminal. "An hour ago, a coordinated, fabricated narrative was leaked to your publications by a recently terminated Sovereign Airways executive named Thomas Arrington, in collusion with a former senior purser named Barbara Gable. The reporters scrambled to point their digital recorders closer. This was not a standard corporate denial. This was a public execution. Misuse. Gable was terminated this morning not because of a violent altercation, but because she engaged in blatant, abhorrent racial profiling," Arthur continued, his eyes locking onto the live broadcast cameras. "She summoned armed police officers to remove me from a seat I legally purchased, simply because I did not fit her prejudiced, archaic view of what wealth looks like. When her bigotry was exposed, she and Mr. Arrington chose to commit federal wire fraud, hacking into Sovereign Airways' internal servers to fabricate a police report." A murmur of shock rippled through the press pool. "If you check your editorial inboxes right now," Arthur said smoothly, checking his vintage Patek Philippe watch, "my communications director, Victoria Hayes, has just released the unedited, high-definition video of the entire encounter, courtesy of a fellow passenger. The video unequivocally proves that the only aggression displayed today was the weaponized racism of a woman who felt entitled to humiliate paying customers." Simultaneously, across the globe, The video hit the internet. Within minutes, it was playing on a continuous loop on CNN, BBC, and Fox Business. The footage was damning. Barbara's sneering, patronizing tone, her blatant lie about the system glitch, her aggressive summoning of the police, and her ultimate, humiliating realization of Arthur's identity were broadcast to millions. In his Manhattan apartment, Thomas Arrington dropped his wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor. His phone immediately began ringing. It wasn't the tabloids congratulating him. It was his private attorney, frantically screaming that the FBI was requesting a warrant for his arrest regarding corporate espionage and unauthorized server access. Barbara Gable stared at the television in absolute horror. Her face, twisted in an ugly racist sneer, was plastered across the bottom third of the news broadcast. Her name was trending globally for all the wrong reasons. The lie she thought would save her had become the very anchor that would drag her to the bottom of the ocean. She hadn't just lost her job. She had made herself entirely unemployable and opened herself up to a massive defamation lawsuit from a billionaire with infinite resources. Furthermore, Arthur's voice boomed from the television screen, snapping Barbara back to her terrifying reality. This incident highlights exactly why Pendleton Capital acquired Sovereign Airways. For too long, the toxic, exclusionary culture of this airline's management has been allowed to fester. As of today, the old guard is gone. We are implementing an immediate, zero-tolerance policy for discrimination of any kind. Any employee found covering up passenger complaints, as Mr. Arrington did, will face immediate termination and legal prosecution. Arthur looked directly into the camera lens, and for a terrifying second, Barbara felt as though he was looking right through the screen, directly into her apartment. Sovereign Airways belongs to everyone now, Arthur finalized. Thank you. Without taking another question, Arthur turned and walked through the terminal, his posture perfectly straight, his scuffed leather briefcase swinging gently at his side. He stepped into a waiting black Bentley, leaving the frenzied press corps behind, to devour the spectacular downfall of Barbara Gable and Thomas Arrington. The hostile takeover was complete. The archaic gatekeepers had been burned to the ground, and Arthur Pendleton had not even needed to raise his voice to light the match. He opened his laptop, poured himself a cup of black coffee from the car's console, and got to work. If you were utterly satisfied by this brilliant corporate checkmate and love seeing arrogant gatekeepers get exactly what they deserve, hit that like button right now. Share this video with a friend who appreciates a perfectly executed revenge story, and don't forget to subscribe for more daily, high-stakes drama stories. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Barbara and Thomas deserve prison time for their stunt, or was public humiliation enough?